A few years ago, my wife declared that it was time for her to start a new hobby. She was going to get into gardening, which means that we were going to get into gardening. She told me that she wanted nothing special, just a small veggie garden, a little herb garden, and she wanted them in raised garden beds. She said that it would help with the weeding. In fact, this was all she talked about for a number of weeks. What type of veggies she'd plant, what sort of soil was needed, what size the raised garden bed should be. And I loved hearing every word. I did pay particularly close attention, though, because I knew what every husband knows when their wife appears one day with a tape measure in hand and a Pinterest board on her phone. I knew that I was soon to be dragged into her schemes. When the snow finally receded and melted away, we went down to Home Depot. We selected our lumber. We loaded up the car with carloads of soil, and I got building. The boys and I even made her a potting table for Mother's Day that year. And she began to plant. And boy, did she plant. We drove around from garden center to garden center looking for very specific herbs and vegetables to add to the new beds. We learned a lot about gardening that year. Number one, you should be careful how close you plant your seeds. Apparently, you can't plant half an acre's worth of vegetables in 32 square feet and not expect them to choke each other out. Number two, I learned that your father-in-law will come over and water your garden bed when you're on vacation, but he will make passive-aggressive comments about it the entire time. And number three, I learned that you have to harvest your veggies at the end of the season. Otherwise, what's the point? I spent the entire summer looking forward to these veggies, looking forward to the fruits of my labors, if you will. The hot peppers, the cucumbers, the thyme. Well, I don't really know what thyme is, but we had a lot of it. And then there were the tomatoes, the delicious, delicious tomatoes. I dreamed of soups and sauces and savory BLTs. And every day I would look out my kitchen window because I had put the planter just outside the window intentionally. And I would look out the window at this raised garden bed and I would watch things begin to grow. And as the season went on, I would watch them begin to ripen. As time went on, those ripe tomatoes started to go from green to red to eventually black. So I went to my wife one day and I came up with a clever strategy. I began to drop subtle hints. Like, those green tomatoes are looking pretty red now. Maybe we should harvest some of them. Oh, those tomatoes are very red. Have you considered maybe harvesting some of those tomatoes? Don't you think the neighbor would like some of these juicy red tomatoes? And finally, honey, the tomatoes are turning black. Maybe it's time to harvest the tomatoes. However, my hints went unheeded. She just smiled and said, I'll get to it. It turns out the harvest never came. Nikki would later confess to me that she didn't actually want to harvest the veggies. She just wanted to see if she could make them grow. Today we continue our journey in Matthew chapter 13 as Jesus shares his own story about a gardener who, like my wife, had some unconventional gardening practices. Well, that's what it looked like halfway through the season. He tells this story while he's sitting in a boat on the shore of a lake. And he's gone to sit by this lake, get a few minutes of peace in nature, but the crowds had followed him. They had needs, they had questions, they pressed in around him. So he extricated himself from the crowd, and he sat in a boat that was likely docked on the shore. And of all the things that he could share with this crowd, he told them this gardening story. He said, a sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seeds fell along the path. The birds came and devoured them. Other seeds fell in rocky ground. They didn't have a lot of soil. They sprang up quickly because the soil wasn't deep, but when the sun came out, they were scorched and they were burned. He said other seeds fell among the thorns, and as they grew up, those thorns choked them out. But other seeds fell on good soil. They produced grain, some 100 times as much, some 60, and some 30. The one who has ears had better listen. Now, could you imagine if you had waited your entire life to speak to the Messiah? And this is the story you get. What kind of riddle is this? What is he even talking about? And who is he to give out gardening tips? Isn't he a carpenter? I mean, if I wanted advice on a miter dovetail joint, I'd be inclined to pull up a chair. But seeds and birds and soil, even the disciples were confused, and they confronted Jesus about it. They said, why do you speak to everyone in parables? Now, what is a parable? Some of you might know, some might not. Let's get caught up. A parable is a short, simple, often allegorical story designed to teach a moral, ethical, or spiritual lesson through analogy. A parable is intended to prompt self-reflection and understanding. The disciples, they want to know why Jesus speaks to them not plainly, but using parables. Sometimes we human beings have this trait where we make our minds up about something and then we stop asking questions. We think we know the answer, so why be curious? And that's a problem. A parable, it helps us to see things we believe we already understand from a different perspective. They make us think. They make us wonder. They make us curious. Like my young son, Paxton, who is 9, he has a bedtime of 8:30. And sometimes around 8:30, he can be really quiet in the other room, just playing with his Legos or quietly watching TV. And we'll let him stay up a little bit later, especially on weekends. But Paxton has not figured this out. As we are relaxing in the living room, watching TV, or just quietly reading, he'll burst into the room, loudly updating us on every single thought that has come into his head. Now, I love to hear all of my children's thoughts, just like I love to hear all of my wife's. But by 8:30, I just want to sit quietly and read a book for an hour before I go to bed. He does not understand this. He does not like reading, as he made clear when I preached for the call 2 years ago. So I told him this parable. I said, son, in World War II, I'm sure you often talk about World War II with your children as well. In World War II, I said, son, radar was fairly primitive. And the Allied forces, they realized that if they flew close to the ground, the enemy's radar signals would pass overhead, and they could fly deep into enemy territory completely undetected. It was a risky move, I told him, but if they successfully flew under the radar, they could go deep into enemy territory and complete their mission. I said, son, in the evening, around 8:30, if you would learn to fly under the radar, I bet you could make it all the way to 9:30. To which my son replied, can I have a snack? No, I said, go to bed. It turns out that Paxton is just incapable of understanding the concept of flying under the radar. If he were a pilot, he would paint his airplane traffic cone orange and take the muffler off his P-51 Mustang just so everyone knew he was coming. But Jesus, he hopes better for his disciples. He hopes better for all those who would listen to his teachings. So very much he wants, with all of his heart, he wants them to understand. He wants them to see, to hear, to fully comprehend the things that he is saying to them. Sometimes he does speak plainly, quite plainly, but other times, quite often, he shares parables. Why? To stir their imagination, to stir their curiosity, to encourage them to examine long-held beliefs about the world, about God, about themselves. He says himself, for this reason, I speak to them in parables. Although they see, they don't see. Although they do not hear, nor do they understand. Concerning them, the prophecy of Isaiah is fulfilled that says, you will listen carefully, but you will never understand. You will look closely, yet you will never comprehend. For the heart of this people has become dull. They are hard of hearing. They have shut their eyes so that they would not see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their hearts and turn, and I would heal them. Do you hear the pain in his voice? He's not talking about bedtime, and he's not talking about gardening. He's talking about healing his family, the children of Abraham, the people called by his name, which he has guided through deserts and wars and back again for 1,000 years, and they refuse to see and they refuse to hear. After all, they are certain that they've got it all right. But they've got it all wrong. And it is poisoning them. And he just knows that if he could somehow break through their stony hearts, he could heal them. If only they would listen, if only they would see. But Jesus refuses to quit trying. And that's what I love about him so much. He's going to keep preaching no matter who hears, who truly hears. Because Jesus, you see, is the sower in the parable. And it may look like he's just scattering seed willy-nilly with no regards for fertile soil. There isn't a single farmer alive who would waste his precious seed throwing it along the road on Highway 11 everywhere abouts. No, they till the ground, they plant it in this one specific area because they know that is where they will have the most success. But for Jesus, that's not the case. And for that, we should be very thankful. Because Jesus is committed to harvesting crops, not just from a 32 square foot planter in the backyard, or even 200 acres. No, Jesus casts his seed everywhere, along the hardened paths, on rocky ground, amongst the weeds, and yes, on fertile soil as well. For you never know where there is a curious heart that is ready to receive it. He explains the meaning of the parable in verse 19. He says, when anyone hears the word about the kingdom, does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches what was sown in his heart. This is the seed that's sown along the path. The seed sown on rocky ground is the person who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy, but he has no root in himself. It does not endure. Troubles or persecution come because of the word, immediately he falls away. The seed sown among the thorns is the person who hears the word, but worldly cares and the seductiveness of wealth choke the word so it produces nothing. But as for the seed sown on good soil, this is the person who hears the word and understands. He bears fruit yielding 160 or 30 times what was sown. I don't know about you, but I've only ever heard this passage of Scripture preached one way. And I've only heard it preached as a warning to make sure that your heart is fertile soil, ready to receive the Word of God. To make sure that your heart isn't hard and unable to comprehend the truth of God's love before the devil snatches it away. To make sure you practice spiritual disciplines like prayer and Bible study and fellowship so that you have deep roots of faith that can weather adversity. Surround yourselves with people who will encourage you in your faith and not lead you into the pursuit of worldly things. In short, we are called through this parable to avoid a hardened, shallow, or distracted heart, to make sure our hearts are fertile soil. For if it is, then you will grow. And in principle, this is good advice. This is sound teaching. Avoid the devil, spend time in prayer, worship and fellowship with other Christians. This sounds like a winning recipe to me. There's only one problem. You see, the soil has very little to say about its condition. A path formed because people have trod on it 1,000 times, 1,000 times, 1,000 times, has been hurt, and it's been abused, and it has learned to protect itself, to close itself off, and that's why it's so hard. The rocky soil, likewise, is not responsible for its shallow depth. From the beginning, it was never given the room it needed to grow deep. Sometimes such soil is lucky that it can grow anything at all. As for the thorny soil, sometimes you don't get to choose which worldviews are planted in you from an early age. The world is full of seeds blowing about in every which way, just looking for a place to put down roots, and some are so thorny that they can choke out anything of beauty, especially if we are too young to know the difference between a tomato and a thistle. When you really think about it, the soil has very little to say over its condition. That's the gardener's job. We could read this parable as an indictment of the state of our own hearts and challenge ourselves to be more fertile soil for God's word, and that would be a worthy endeavor. You'll probably hear a sermon from me in the future along those lines. We could applaud ourselves for our great faith, even as we judge the thin, rocky soil outside of these four walls. You probably won't hear a sermon from me with that as the thesis. Or we can marvel at the extravagant generosity of the sower who casts his seed far and wide with no regards for conventional gardening practices, because he hopes upon hope that all soil, regardless of the condition in which he finds it, will bear abundant fruit when he's done with it. Because this gardener can work miracles. So he preaches to the one who has been trampled underfoot, saying, I will walk beside you, not on top of you. And he whispers to the one who doubts, saying, I know what you've been through, because I've been through it too. And he speaks to the one whose heart is filled with hate, saying, let me in, and I will show you a better way. I will show you what love looks like, true love, not the shallow alternatives that the world offers. You see, people must have wondered why Jesus spent his time preaching to the hard-hearted Pharisees who knew it all and had it all figured out, or the greedy Sadducees who cared for nothing more than their own wealth, their own power, or to the average person who just simply scoffed and jeered and who would ultimately call for his crucifixion. And we today might wonder the same. Why do we gather week in and week out to proclaim the gospel message as Jesus did before us? Why do we share our faith with our neighbors and our coworkers? We don't know the state of their soil. Why do we deliver groceries and sacrifice our time to volunteer in nursery or on the tech team? Why do we make 1,491 Valentine's Day cards just to hand out in nursing homes and hand out to people in hospice and to anyone who we feel could use a little love, especially when we know that there is a lot more rocky soil out there than fertile ground these days? The answer is simple. Because our God is overwhelmingly generous with his love. He refuses to fly under the radar when it comes to his love. And he will risk wasting his time, and he will risk rejection, and he will even risk death to sow a seed. Because sometimes seeds, they grow in the most unlikely places. This very morning as I was leaving my house, even in Victoria Harbor, where the snow is high, we've had a few days of warmth and of sunshine. And the sun, it beats off of the brick wall of our Century home and back onto the ground. And slowly a little space has been created. Not much, maybe 8 inches, maybe 9. I saw it to begin to emerge between the house and the snowbank a few days ago. And then it snowed and it got covered over again, but then it came back. And this morning as I was leaving the house, what did I see? Maybe 8, maybe 10, maybe 12 little blades shooting up on March 1st alongside my house. Sometimes seeds, they grow in the most unlikely places. And sometimes those seeds will put down roots and they will open up to the bright sun and they will send other seeds out into the world to hopefully, to prayerfully find new soil. And one day, that crop will be ready for the harvest, which God will gather unto himself from far and wide at just the right time. Because unlike another gardener that I know and love, God doesn't want to just plant seeds. This gardener, the heavenly gardener, he desires to gather in a bountiful harvest, which is simply a parable exposing God's true heart, that this world would hear with their ears and understand with their hearts and turn so that he could heal them. And it all begins with a seed.